In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a V-neckline and a couple of ideas on how to create and add a rib trim. I'm knitting this sample just for the purpose of demonstrating the technique, so it will be a bit smaller than an actual garment. To create a V-neckline, you have to do it one side at a time, just like you do for a crew neck. Let's say that we have finished knitting our body and we are ready to start shaping the neckline now. My carriage is on the left side, so I'm going to put needles on hold to the opposite side where my carriage is. So the needles that remain in action are closest to the carriage. And to put needles on hold, I'm just bringing them all the way out. To set the carriage to hold for the border, all you have to do is to move the holding cam lever from N to H. Let's assume that we have to decrease one stitch every 2 rows to shape this neckline, but your calculations might be different. You might need to decrease every 3 rows, every 5 rows. It depends on your gauge. As you can see, we're creating a float on top of these needles that are on hold, and we're only knitting with half of the needles. I like to transfer to decrease using at least a 3-prong tool so I can see the fashioning, but you can choose to use a different tool if you like. So I'm grabbing the 3 stitches in the middle and all together transferring them once to the left and the third. This needle is now without a stitch and the third needle has 2 stitches, and of course this half will have now 1 less stitch. We'll continue decreasing every 2 rows. It is a good idea to place a claw weight right here. Don't forget to put that needle out of action. Let's assume that we have finished now one side, so we can just cast off. Once you finish one side, you can remove it like so. When I finished one side, what I usually like to do is to move the carriage, so my carriage is still in hold, and I will move it to the other side. The reason why I'm moving the carriage to the other side is that so when I knit across, the loose end will not be in the middle of my neckline, it will be here on the side. So now I can take my carriage from holding position by moving the holding cam lever to N. I will knit 2 rows just like I did on the other side. And I will begin decreasing just like I did on the other side every 2 rows using my 3-prong tool. I love adding small details to my knitted pieces, and one way to do it is by adding details to the fashioning. I've made a video on how to add details to your fashioning, which is available to see on my Patreon. If you want to check it out, I will leave the link for my Patreon in the description down below. On Patreon, you can also support my channel if you enjoy the content. Thank you so much for everyone supporting me. It really means the world, and it helps me continue making these videos. So for this example, as you can see, I added a 2-needle ladder right here next to the fashioning, which I think it's really pretty, and I'll show you how to do that. Basically, I will skip 4 stitches from the very edge and transfer 1 stitch to empty 1 needle. You can transfer to the left or to the right, it's up to you. I will leave this needle out of action to form a ladder. I will transfer one more stitch so that I have 2 empty needles. You can see I have 3 needles here at the edge, 2 empty ones, and I will need 2 more rows. Now I can decrease using a 3-prong tool. I will grab the 3 stitches at the edge, transfer them 1 stitch to the left, and now you can see that I have a 1 needle ladder, but I want to have a 2 needle ladder, so all I need to do is to also transfer the next 3 stitches, again 1 stitch to the left. In this example, I knitted 4 rows. It really doesn't matter the order you're doing the transfers, as long as you end up with having a 2 needle ladder every time. I found that having just a 1 needle ladder, it's actually not enough to be noticeable. To stop this ladder from forming, all you have to do is to grab the purl bar from a stitch and form a new stitch like so. Sorry to bring up my Patreon again, but the reason I'm making this video is as an extra resource for my patrons, as we are currently making a V-neck jumper together. So I've recorded the entire process from calculating your gauge, creating the paper pattern, planning your decreases, and now knitting, and then we're going to put it together next week. And I wanted to show you the V-neck that I created for that jumper that I'm sharing there. And in the next clip, you will see a small section taken from part 4 of making a V-neck jumper, where I'm talking all about the trim, how I calculated it, and also how I increased to shape this here, and all the details. All that came to 67 centimeters. So the whole rib of my neckline should be 67 centimeters. Here is the tension swatch for my neck trim. And what I did, I measured it to find out how many stitches I have per 1 centimeters. Rib is 15 centimeters. I know I cast on 40 stitches. 40 stitches divided by 15 centimeters equal 2.66. That means I have 2.66 stitches per 1 centimeters. I then calculated that times 67, and it gives me 178 stitches in total. It will depend on the length of your rib. You might actually have to do it in 2 separate pieces. Just see how long is your neckline and if you could fit the whole rib on your machine. I was lucky and I could do that, but if I couldn't, I would have just knitted it in 2 separate pieces and sew it at the back or at the side of the neckline. And here I have just a little test, because this will be the front of my panel. I want to join the rib. It will be a continuous loop and it will be joined right at the front in the middle. And in order to shape this, all I did was, basically this is the cast on, and it's knitted that way, cast on, and you can see that I increased. By increasing, I create this angle here, and then when I put it here like that, I have this nice edge. If I wouldn't have increased, as you can imagine, when you join them here at the front, it would be like this, right? So it wouldn't sit nice. So this is what I figured that would work. I will see, I haven't done this before, but I think it will work really nicely. And I'll show you exactly how I increased. This is how I'm increasing. I'm just grabbing the last stitch on main bed and transfer it over to, so I skipped, this is where the stitch was. I'm skipping this one and I'm transferring it over. I will transfer one more stitch like that on main bed and ribber bed as well. We'll place these needles that I emptied back in action, and I will knit 2 rows. And I will repeat increasing like that every 2 rows for as long as my rib will be. That will also create a little hole right where I'm increasing, but I don't mind as I also have lace holes in the rib. I think that will look really pretty. Next, I will show you another way you can increase a 1x1 rib. You can see that the last needle in action is on ribber bed, and I have the same on the other side, so my edges are the same. So I will grab the first 2 stitches on main bed and transfer them 1 stitch to the right. And I will repeat the same on ribber bed. The next step is to grab the purl bar from the 3rd needle on a ribber bed. You can pull it down a little bit like so you make it easier. And transfer it to the next stitch on the right like so. So we are forming a new stitch right here. I will repeat the same on the other side. And I'll knit 2 rows. We'll repeat the same process, transfer over 1 stitch, form another stitch, I'm going to use these to attach a weight on the edge, just because when I'm increasing I kind of don't have enough weight on the edge, so that will help me avoid getting any drop stitches. I'll use a smaller one. Knit 2 more rows. You can see now that we have 3 stitches next to each other right here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to transfer the stitch in the very middle on the main bed. Now we have again a 1x1 rib across, and I'll continue increasing just like I did before. Transfer over 1 stitch on main bed and ribber bed as well. And form a new stitch on ribber bed. Things might get a bit tight here, so to avoid any accidents, it is always a good idea to pull the needles all the way out before knitting rows. Before knitting the last row, I will increase the tension. That will give me a looser loop for the last row, and it will make attaching the rib to my body a bit easier if I'm using a linker or if I'm doing it by hand. I had tension 2 before, I will increase it to tension 5. All I have to do now is to knit some rows in waste yarn, ideally in a contrast color. Remove all the weights and drop the stitches. This is how the edge looks like, and now when we're sewing these together we get a really nice detail. You can choose to increase and transfer only 1 stitch at the edge, or you can also not grab the purl bar to form a new stitch and just put a needle in action to form an eyelet. There's all different options you can try, but don't forget to always test your trims before jumping into a final project. See which one you prefer and how it looks. It's always important to test, I cannot stress that enough. You can choose to have this as your right side or this side, whichever you prefer. They are slightly different. Like I mentioned before, how you increase your rib will depend on your v-neck. And you can see for this one, we decreased every 4 rows and how the edge is quite straight. And looking at the one we decreased every 2 rows, the edge is a bit more, how do you say, the angle is much more dramatic. All I have now to do is to sew the trim to the body, and I'll show you in a minute how to do that, but I just want to show you. Looking at this now, I can see that this doesn't sit as flat as I would want it to sit. But if we are placing the one where we increased 2 stitches at once, this sits much nicer and flatter. So these are all things to consider when you're shaping your rib or when you're shaping your V. I think the second one that we created would sit much nicer with this one where we decreased every 2 rows. If we just place it like that, you can see what I mean now that we are putting this here where it would be sewn. It sits much flatter than it sat on the other one. If you do not wish to shape the rib and keep the straight edges, you can sew it like that. You can see you would sew one side first and then you would sew the other one and they would overlap in the middle, and then you can just sew this edge nicely there. It is of course up to you which method you want to use. If you have a linker, all you have to do is to place the edge onto your linker and then place the rib like that and just sew it. But if you do not have one, you can use a latch tool. You would of course have to make sure to pin this properly so you ensure that you're sewing it nice and straight. Here I'm just showing you the technique quickly. I'm just catching the first stitch on my body. You can see how using a contrast color waste yarn is quite helpful, and having that loose row also makes my life a bit easier. So I'm placing that latch tool through and I will pull the yarn through. Bringing it to the wrong side, we will form a chain, and we'll continue like that, catching the first stitch, going through the last loop of my rib, catching the yarn, pulling it through, forming another chain. As you could see, I used a mattress stitch to join the rib that I shaped together. I haven't done a perfect job as I rushed, but this could look really nice, and I really like when you can see the fashioning. It's all up to you how you prefer to do it. I've seen on some jumpers that I own that what they did was they literally used a sewing machine and sewed the rib together, which I don't personally prefer, but that's an option as well. You could just sew it straight, but then you would get these flaps inside. If you don't mind, you can do that as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and you've learned a couple of things, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.